My name is Margaret Thompson, and at 52 years old, I thought I had seen enough cruelty in this world to prepare me for anything. I was wrong. Tonight, as our family gathered around the dinner table for what should have been a peaceful Sunday meal, my son-in-law Derek grabbed my daughter Stephanie's hair and yanked her head back so hard I heard her neck crack. The sound echoed through our dining room like a gunshot. But what happened next froze my blood completely. Derek's father Frank, sitting right across from me with his wine glass raised, looked at his son with pure pride and said those two words that will haunt me forever: "Good boy." Then he smiled. The entire room fell silent except for my daughter's quiet whimpering. I set down my fork, placed my hands flat on the table, and slowly stood up. Before we dive into how this nightmare began, I need to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like button if you believe no one should ever suffer in silence. Make sure to subscribe because this story gets much darker before it gets better, and you won't want to miss how one mother's love became a force more powerful than violence itself. 3 years ago, when my husband Robert died suddenly from a heart attack, I thought my world had ended. We had built our life together around simple pleasures: Sunday barbecues, helping Stephanie with college, and planning for grandchildren we'd never get to spoil together. Robert's death left me drowning in medical bills and mortgage payments on our modest home in Cedar Falls. At 49, I found myself working double shifts at the county clerk's office just to keep food on the table and maintain some semblance of the life Stephanie had always known. Stephanie was 23 then, fresh out of college with a degree in marketing and dreams bigger than our small Iowa town could contain. She had inherited her father's gentle spirit and my stubborn determination, a combination that made her both incredibly kind and fiercely independent. For 2 years, it was just us against the world. We grew closer than we had ever been, sharing late-night conversations about her job search, my struggles with loneliness, and our mutual determination to honor Robert's memory by living fully despite our grief. Then Derek Caldwell walked into Murphy's coffee shop on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, and everything changed. I remember Stephanie calling me that afternoon, her voice bright with excitement as she described the handsome stranger who had bought her coffee and asked for her number. Derek was 28, tall with dark hair and the kind of confident smile that made people stop and stare. He drove a brand new BMW, wore expensive suits, and claimed to work in real estate development. Most importantly to Stephanie, he seemed completely captivated by her. What I didn't know then was that the Caldwell family had been watching us for months. Frank Caldwell owned half the commercial property in town and had his fingers in every major business deal for 3 counties. His influence reached into City Hall, the police department, and even the courthouse where I worked. Derek wasn't some chance encounter at a coffee shop. He was a predator who had identified my daughter as the perfect target: beautiful, intelligent, but emotionally vulnerable after losing her father. The courtship was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as romance. Derek showered Stephanie with expensive gifts, weekend trips to Chicago, and constant attention that felt like love but was actually a carefully constructed trap. He would text her dozens of times throughout the day, always framed as concern for her well-being or excitement about their relationship. When she didn't respond immediately, he would call repeatedly until she answered, explaining that he just missed her voice. At first, Stephanie found his intensity flattering. She had never experienced such focused attention from someone who seemed so successful and put together. I began noticing changes in my daughter within the first month. She started declining our weekly movie nights, explaining that Derek had planned something special for them instead. When I suggested she invite him to join us for dinner, she would make excuses about his busy schedule or his preference for finer restaurants than we could afford. Slowly but systematically, Derek was erasing me from Stephanie's life while positioning himself as the only person who truly understood and appreciated her. The first real warning sign came during Thanksgiving dinner 6 months into their relationship. Derek arrived at our house wearing a suit that probably cost more than I made in a month, carrying an expensive bottle of wine and flowers for me that felt more like a business transaction than a gesture of affection. Throughout dinner, he peppered his conversation with subtle criticisms of our home, our food, and our traditions, always delivered with a charming smile that made his words seem like friendly observations rather than deliberate insults. When Stephanie mentioned a promotion opportunity at her marketing firm, Derek immediately began explaining why the additional responsibility would be too stressful for someone with her sensitive nature. He suggested she might be happier in a less demanding role, somewhere she wouldn't have to deal with difficult clients or tight deadlines. As he spoke, I watched my confident, ambitious daughter shrink into herself, nodding along as this man systematically dismantled her professional dreams while making it sound like he was protecting her. That night, after Derek left, I tried to talk to Stephanie about my concerns. I chose my words carefully, expressing support for her happiness while gently questioning whether Derek truly knew her well enough to make such definitive statements about her capabilities. Stephanie's response chilled me to the bone. She accused me of being jealous of her relationship because I was alone, suggesting that my concerns stemmed from my own grief and loneliness rather than genuine worry about her well-being. The cruel precision of her words felt foreign, as if someone else had placed them in her mouth. By spring, Derek's control over Stephanie had become absolute, though she couldn't see it herself. He had convinced her to quit her marketing job, claiming that his real estate connections could provide better opportunities for someone with her skills. Instead of the promised career advancement, Stephanie found herself working part-time at Derek's father's property management company, essentially functioning as an unpaid assistant while Derek controlled every aspect of her professional life. The financial manipulation was subtle but devastating. Derek insisted on paying for everything during their dates, gradually training Stephanie to become dependent on his generosity. When she expressed discomfort about not contributing financially to their relationship, he suggested she close her checking account and add her name to his instead. This would simplify their finances and demonstrate their commitment to a shared future, he explained. Within weeks, Stephanie had no access to money that Derek didn't approve, though she continued to believe this arrangement proved how much he trusted and loved her. I discovered the extent of Derek's financial control during what would become our first major confrontation. Stephanie had mentioned wanting to buy me a birthday gift but seemed unusually stressed about the expense. When I pressed her gently, she admitted that Derek reviewed all their account activity and questioned any purchases he hadn't pre-approved. She tried to frame this as responsible financial planning, but I could see the fear in her eyes when she talked about having to justify buying her own mother a gift. That evening, I called Derek directly and asked to meet him for coffee. I chose a public location and planned my words carefully, hoping to appeal to his better nature if such a thing existed. Derek arrived 30 minutes late, offering no apology but explaining that an important business call had delayed him. His casual disrespect for my time felt intentional, a way of establishing dominance before our conversation even began. I started by acknowledging how happy Stephanie seemed with him, then gently expressed my concerns about her increasing isolation from family and friends. Derek listened with the patient expression of someone humoring a child, occasionally nodding as if my words carried weight. When I finished speaking, he leaned back in his chair and smiled the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Derek's response was a masterpiece of manipulation wrapped in concern for my emotional state. He explained that he understood how difficult it must be for me to watch Stephanie grow up and build a life separate from mine. He acknowledged that losing my husband had probably made me more dependent on my relationship with Stephanie for emotional support. His words were delivered with such apparent compassion that anyone overhearing might have thought he was offering comfort rather than delivering psychological warfare. Then came the devastating blow. Derek explained that Stephanie had confided in him about feeling guilty for being happy when I was still grieving. She worried that her joy was somehow disrespectful to her father's memory and that I resented her relationship because it highlighted my own loneliness. He suggested that my attempts to interfere in their relationship were actually hurting Stephanie's healing process and preventing her from moving forward with her life. The conversation concluded with Derek offering to help me find grief counseling resources and suggesting that some distance between Stephanie and me might be healthy for both of us. He spoke as if he were prescribing medicine rather than systematically destroying the most important relationship in my daughter's life. As I sat in that coffee shop, watching this monster dismantle my concerns with practiced ease, I realized I was dealing with someone far more dangerous than I had imagined. That night, I tried calling Stephanie to discuss my meeting with Derek. She answered on the first ring, but her voice was cold in a way I had never heard before. Derek had already told her about our conversation, she said, and she was disappointed that I would go behind her back instead of respecting her choices. She accused me of trying to sabotage her happiness because I couldn't handle being alone. For the first time in my daughter's life, she hung up on me. For 3 months, Stephanie refused to take my calls or respond to my texts. Derek had successfully convinced her that maintaining our relationship was somehow betraying him and preventing her from fully committing to their future together. During those 90 days of silence, I experienced a grief almost as profound as losing my husband. The difference was that Robert was gone through no choice of his own, while Stephanie was choosing to disappear from my life at the direction of a man who was systematically destroying everything beautiful about her. My isolation during those months nearly broke me completely. I would come home from work to an empty house and find myself talking to Robert's photograph, begging him to help me save our daughter from something I couldn't yet fully understand. Some nights, I would drive past the apartment Derek and Stephanie shared, hoping to catch a glimpse of her and reassure myself that she was still alive and unharmed. The few times I saw her, she looked thin and tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. My salvation came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived in the duplex next to Derek and Stephanie, knocked on my door one evening in late summer. She was a retired school nurse in her 70s, with the kind of no-nonsense wisdom that comes from spending decades caring for other people's children. Mrs. Rodriguez had been observing the dynamics between Derek and Stephanie, and what she saw worried her enough to seek me out. She told me about the nights when she heard Stephanie crying through the thin walls, always followed by Derek's voice raised in what sounded like lectures or arguments. She had witnessed him screening Stephanie's phone calls and mail, often discarding things without letting her see them. Most disturbing, Mrs. Rodriguez had noticed that Stephanie no longer left their apartment alone, always accompanied by Derek or remaining inside entirely when he was away. The vibrant young woman who had moved in 6 months earlier had become a shadow of herself, and Mrs. Rodriguez recognized the signs of an abusive relationship from her years working with children from troubled homes. Having an ally who could confirm my instincts about Derek's true nature gave me the strength to start fighting back. Mrs. Rodriguez and I began meeting weekly, sharing information and developing strategies to reach Stephanie. We knew that any direct approach would likely backfire, driving her further into Derek's control. Instead, we needed to be patient and wait for an opportunity to plant seeds of doubt that might eventually grow into the courage she would need to escape. The wedding happened on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Derek had first approached Stephanie in that coffee shop. I learned about it 3 days after the ceremony, when Mrs. Rodriguez called to tell me she had seen them returning from what appeared to be a honeymoon trip. Derek had orchestrated the entire event in secret, convincing Stephanie that a small, intimate ceremony would be more meaningful than a traditional wedding with family involvement. In reality, he wanted no witnesses to his final claim of ownership over my daughter. The marriage certificate was signed at the county courthouse with only Derek's father Frank and a secretary as witnesses. Stephanie wore a simple white dress that Derek had chosen for her, and they exchanged vows that Frank had written emphasizing obedience and loyalty above love and partnership. Mrs. Rodriguez managed to get a copy of the marriage license from her friend who worked in the clerk's office, and seeing Stephanie's signature on that document felt like watching her sign her own death warrant. Derek's behavior became significantly more controlling once they were legally married. He installed security cameras throughout their apartment, ostensibly for their protection but actually to monitor Stephanie's activities when he wasn't home. He changed their phone plan to one that allowed him to track her location and review all her calls and messages. When Stephanie expressed discomfort about these measures, Derek explained that as her husband, he had both the right and responsibility to ensure her safety in an increasingly dangerous world. The first incident of physical violence occurred 6 weeks after their wedding, though I didn't learn about it until much later. Derek had discovered that Stephanie had been saving small amounts of cash from their grocery budget, hoping to eventually buy Christmas gifts for our extended family. When confronted, she explained that she missed giving presents to people she loved and wanted to maintain some family traditions. Derek's response was swift and brutal. He slapped her hard enough to leave a handprint on her face, then spent 2 hours explaining why her secret behavior constituted a betrayal of their marriage vows. More disturbing than the violence itself was Derek's ability to convince Stephanie that she had provoked the attack through her deceptive behavior. He framed the assault as a natural consequence of her choice to lie about money, suggesting that any husband would react similarly to such a fundamental breach of trust. By the time Derek finished his explanation, Stephanie found herself apologizing to him and promising never to keep secrets again, no matter how innocent her intentions might be. My first concrete evidence of Derek's true nature came from an unexpected source. During a routine background check for a new employee at the county clerk's office, I discovered that Derek had been arrested for domestic violence in Minnesota 3 years earlier. The charges had been dropped when his girlfriend at the time suddenly moved to another state and became unavailable to testify, but the police reports painted a disturbing picture of escalating abuse that followed the same pattern I was witnessing with Stephanie. Armed with this information, I made the decision to confront Derek and his father directly. Frank Caldwell maintained his office in the most expensive building in town, a gleaming monument to his financial success and political influence. His secretary tried to turn me away, explaining that Mr. Caldwell only saw people by appointment, but I had learned from Derek's tactics and refused to be dismissed. I sat in that waiting room for 4 hours until Frank finally agreed to see me, more out of curiosity than courtesy. Frank Caldwell was a larger, older version of his son, with the same predatory smile and the same ability to make cruelty sound like kindness. When I presented him with the police reports from Minnesota, he barely glanced at them before explaining that successful men often become targets for false accusations from unstable women seeking financial gain. He suggested that my decision to bring these allegations to him proved that I was exactly the kind of vindictive, jealous mother that Derek had warned him about. Then Frank revealed the true extent of their power and their willingness to use it against me. He explained that he had been monitoring my activities since I first started asking questions about Derek's background. He knew about my financial struggles, my spotty credit history since Robert's death, and my vulnerable position as a single woman with limited resources. If I continued to interfere in Derek and Stephanie's marriage, Frank would use his influence to make my life very difficult in ways I couldn't imagine. The threat became reality faster than I had thought possible. 2 weeks after my meeting with Frank, I was called into my supervisor's office and informed that budget cuts would require my position to be eliminated. The explanation was delivered with apologetic smiles and promises of excellent references, but I knew exactly what had happened. Frank Caldwell had made a phone call, and I had become expendable. Losing my job was devastating both financially and psychologically. Without steady income, I couldn't maintain the mortgage payments on the house Robert and I had shared for 20 years. The home where we had raised Stephanie, celebrated holidays, and built our life together had to be sold quickly and for less than it was worth. I found myself moving into a cramped apartment across town, surrounded by boxes of memories and struggling to imagine how I would survive financially while continuing to fight for my daughter. The apartment was a 1-bedroom unit in a complex that had seen better decades, with thin walls and neighbors who worked night shifts or dealt with their own versions of crisis and desperation. At 50, I was starting over in ways I had never imagined, eating generic brand food and shopping at thrift stores while trying to maintain some dignity in a situation designed to destroy my spirit. Frank Caldwell's message was clear. This is what happens to women who challenge the natural order of things. During this period of upheaval, Derek's abuse of Stephanie escalated dramatically. Mrs. Rodriguez reported hearing sounds of violence through the apartment walls, followed by long periods of silence that were somehow more frightening than the noise had been. She occasionally saw Stephanie with bruises that were poorly concealed by makeup, always accompanied by explanations about clumsiness or accidents that became increasingly unbelievable. The most chilling development was Derek's decision to involve his father more directly in Stephanie's punishment and control. Frank began visiting their apartment regularly, conducting what he called family meetings where he would lecture Stephanie about her duties as a wife and the consequences of disappointing the Caldwell family. These sessions often lasted for hours and left Stephanie visibly shaken, though she could never explain to Mrs. Rodriguez what had been discussed. My determination to save Stephanie found new direction when I met Sarah Martinez at a domestic violence awareness event hosted by our local library. Sarah was a 35-year-old attorney who had escaped an abusive marriage herself and now volunteered her legal services to help other women navigate the complex process of breaking free from dangerous relationships. She had the kind of fierce compassion that comes from personal experience and the professional skills necessary to take on powerful men like Frank Caldwell. When I explained Stephanie's situation and my own struggles with the Caldwell family's retaliation, Sarah immediately recognized the classic pattern of institutional abuse. Men like Frank and Derek didn't simply target individual women. They used their wealth and influence to create entire systems designed to protect their right to dominate and control. Taking them on would require more than emotional appeals or family interventions. It would demand a coordinated legal strategy backed by solid evidence and unwavering determination. Sarah agreed to represent me pro bono in exchange for my help documenting and exposing what she believed was a much larger pattern of abuse involving multiple women over many years. She suspected that Derek's ex-girlfriend in Minnesota was not his first victim and that Frank had been using his influence to cover up his son's crimes for decades. Our goal was not simply to save Stephanie, but to build a case strong enough to permanently stop both men from harming anyone else. Our investigation began with a thorough review of public records, court documents, and police reports from multiple jurisdictions where the Caldwell family had lived or conducted business. What we discovered was a disturbing pattern of complaints that had been dropped, witnesses who had suddenly become unavailable, and law enforcement officials who had consistently found reasons to avoid pursuing charges against Derek despite overwhelming evidence of his violence. The breakthrough came when Sarah located two other women who had been involved with Derek at different times over the past 8 years. Both had experienced the same cycle of romantic manipulation followed by increasing isolation, financial control, and escalating physical abuse. More importantly, both had attempted to press charges against Derek only to find themselves facing legal harassment, job loss, and threats against their families that forced them to abandon their cases and relocate to other states. Armed with this information, Sarah and I developed a comprehensive strategy to expose the Caldwell family's pattern of abuse while simultaneously protecting Stephanie from immediate harm. We would need to gather evidence carefully and quietly, building an airtight case before making any moves that might trigger retaliation. The process would be slow and dangerous, but it offered the best hope of permanently ending the cycle of violence that had trapped multiple women over the years. Our first major challenge came when Frank and Derek hired a private investigator to monitor my activities and gather information they could use to discredit me. The investigator, a former police detective named Marcus Webb, was skilled at staying hidden while documenting every aspect of my daily routine. He followed me to work, to the grocery store, to my meetings with Sarah, and even to my visits with Mrs. Rodriguez. His presence was a constant reminder that the Caldwell family was watching and waiting for an opportunity to strike back. The surveillance became harassment when Webb began approaching my neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances with questions about my mental stability, financial problems, and relationship with alcohol. He presented himself as a concerned friend gathering information to help me get the support I needed, but his real goal was to plant seeds of doubt about my credibility and emotional state. The campaign was subtle but effective. People who had known me for years began treating me with the careful politeness reserved for someone who might be dangerous or unstable. Frank and Derek's most devastating attack came when they orchestrated a public confrontation designed to make me appear unhinged and obsessive. They arranged for Stephanie to be shopping alone at our local grocery store during a time when they knew I would be there for my weekly shopping trip. When I approached my daughter to attempt a conversation, Derek appeared suddenly with a video camera, filming as he loudly demanded that I stop harassing his wife and threatening their safety. The video showed me pursuing Stephanie through the store while she appeared frightened and tried to get away from me. What it didn't show was Derek positioned just out of frame, directing Stephanie's movements and responses with subtle hand signals and whispered instructions. To anyone watching the edited footage, I appeared to be an unstable woman stalking a terrified young mother who just wanted to be left alone. Within hours, the video was posted on social media with captions describing me as a dangerous stalker who was threatening Derek and Stephanie's safety. The Caldwell family's influence ensured that the video received maximum exposure throughout our community, generating hundreds of comments from people who condemned my behavior without knowing the full context. Some viewers even called for my arrest, suggesting that I clearly posed a threat to my own daughter's well-being. The social media campaign had its intended effect. Within days, I received a restraining order requiring me to stay at least 500 feet away from Stephanie, Derek, their home, and Stephanie's workplace. The order was granted based on the video evidence and testimony from Frank Caldwell, who claimed that I had been making threatening phone calls and following his daughter-in-law for weeks. No one asked for my side of the story or considered the possibility that the evidence had been manufactured. The restraining order represented my lowest point in the entire ordeal. I was legally prohibited from having any contact with my only child, who was trapped in an increasingly violent marriage with no apparent hope of escape. The isolation was crushing. Many of my friends and acquaintances had seen the video and believed I had become mentally unstable following my husband's death. Even those who might have doubted the Caldwell family's version of events were afraid to associate with me publicly, fearing retaliation from Frank's extensive network of business and political connections. During the darkest nights of that period, I seriously considered ending my own life. The combination of grief, isolation, financial stress, and helplessness seemed insurmountable. I had lost my husband, my daughter, my home, my job, and my reputation. The Caldwell family had systematically destroyed everything that gave my life meaning, and they had done it with such skill that the entire community believed I was the villain in the story. What saved me was the knowledge that my death would leave Stephanie completely alone with her abusers. Mrs. Rodriguez and Sarah Martinez reminded me repeatedly that I was the only person in Stephanie's life who knew the truth about Derek and Frank. If I gave up, no one would be left to fight for her when she eventually found the courage to ask for help. My survival became an act of love, a way of keeping hope alive for a daughter who had forgotten she deserved to be saved. The call came at 2:30 in the morning on a Tuesday in November. Mrs. Rodriguez's voice was shaking as she told me that an ambulance had taken Stephanie to the hospital an hour earlier. She had heard sounds of a violent struggle through the apartment walls, followed by Derek's voice screaming accusations about imagined betrayals and disrespect. When the paramedics arrived, they found Stephanie unconscious at the bottom of their staircase with what appeared to be serious head injuries. I violated the restraining order without hesitation, driving to the hospital in my pajamas and spending the rest of the night in the emergency room waiting area. Derek was already there, playing the role of concerned husband with devastating effectiveness. He explained to anyone who would listen that Stephanie had been drinking heavily lately due to stress about her estranged relationship with her mentally unstable mother. She had apparently fallen down the stairs while intoxicated, a tragic accident that could have been prevented if I had respected their wishes for no contact. The medical staff treated Derek with sympathy and respect while regarding me with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. The restraining order was public record, and Derek had made sure everyone knew about my alleged harassment of his wife. When I tried to explain the real situation to a nurse, she suggested that I might want to seek professional help for my grief and resentment before I caused more harm to my daughter's recovery process. Stephanie regained consciousness the next morning, but the woman who opened her eyes was not the daughter I had raised. The head injury had left her disoriented and confused, struggling to remember basic details about her life and relationships. More disturbing was the terror that filled her face whenever someone mentioned calling her mother. Derek had used the trauma and confusion to convince her that I was the source of all her problems, a dangerous person who had caused her accident through my persistent harassment and threats. I managed to spend 15 minutes alone with Stephanie before Derek returned from his meeting with the doctors. She looked at me with the fearful recognition of someone who has been taught to see love as danger. When I tried to hold her hand, she pulled away and whispered that she was sorry, but Derek had explained how my mental illness was making me believe things that weren't true. She begged me to get help and leave them alone, promising that she still loved me but couldn't have me in her life until I stopped being dangerous. The conversation was devastating not because Stephanie was being cruel, but because I could see the genuine fear and confusion in her eyes. Derek had taken advantage of her vulnerability to implant false memories and rewrite the history of our relationship. In her current state, I truly did appear to be a threatening stranger rather than the mother who had loved and protected her for 24 years. Derek's return to the hospital room brought Frank Caldwell and a security guard who immediately escorted me from the building. As I was being removed, Frank whispered that this was just the beginning of what would happen if I continued to interfere in their family's business. He described in graphic detail what he would do to ensure that I never bothered them again, threats that were delivered with the calm confidence of a man who had never faced consequences for his actions. That night, I called Sarah Martinez and told her that I was ready to abandon our legal strategy and accept defeat. The head injury had given Derek complete control over Stephanie's narrative, and fighting back would only result in more retaliation against both of us. Sarah listened patiently to my despair, then reminded me that domestic violence victims often experience multiple serious injuries before they find the strength to leave. Stephanie's hospitalization wasn't the end of our fight, it was evidence that Derek's violence was escalating toward murder. Sarah's words sparked something fierce and dangerous inside me. I realized that my previous approaches had been too careful, too concerned with maintaining moral high ground in a fight against people who recognized no moral boundaries. If I wanted to save Stephanie's life, I would need to become ruthless enough to match the Caldwell family's brutality while smart enough to avoid their mistakes. My transformation began with learning everything I could about Frank Caldwell's business operations and personal vulnerabilities. I spent weeks in the library researching property records, court filings, and newspaper archives, looking for patterns and connections that might reveal illegal activities or hidden weaknesses. What I discovered was a complex web of financial manipulation, political corruption, and tax evasion that had made Frank wealthy while keeping him vulnerable to exposure. The breakthrough came when I found evidence that Frank had been systematically defrauding elderly residents of the nursing homes he owned through a scheme involving unnecessary medical procedures and inflated billing. The scheme required cooperation from doctors, administrators, and government inspectors, all of whom received substantial payments for their participation in what amounted to institutionalized elder abuse. More importantly, for my immediate purposes, I discovered that Frank had serious gambling debts to organized crime figures in Chicago. His successful businessman image was largely facade. He was actually leveraged to the point of potential bankruptcy and dependent on increasingly risky schemes to maintain his lifestyle and political influence. The knowledge that Frank Caldwell was not nearly as powerful as he appeared gave me the confidence to start fighting back with techniques he had taught me through his own example. I began my counterattack by documenting every instance of harassment and retaliation I had experienced since first challenging Derek's treatment of Stephanie. Sarah helped me install hidden cameras in my apartment and recording devices in my purse, creating an evidence trail that would be crucial for any future legal proceedings. We also established secure communication methods and backup plans in case the Caldwell family's retaliation escalated to physical violence. My first direct action was to leak information about Frank's nursing home fraud to an investigative reporter at the state's largest newspaper. I provided copies of financial records, medical files, and witness statements that painted a clear picture of systematic abuse spanning multiple facilities over several years. The reporter was initially skeptical about my motives, but the evidence was too compelling to ignore. The newspaper's investigation triggered a federal inquiry that froze Frank's assets and subjected his business operations to intense scrutiny. Within weeks, he was facing potential criminal charges and civil lawsuits that threatened to destroy everything he had built over the past 30 years. The pressure forced him to withdraw from several political campaigns he had been secretly funding and significantly reduced his ability to retaliate against me through official channels. Derek's response to his father's legal troubles was to escalate his abuse of Stephanie dramatically. Mrs. Rodriguez reported hearing increasingly violent confrontations that often lasted for hours and left Stephanie screaming for help that never came. The isolation was complete. Derek had convinced her that calling for help would result in criminal charges against him and financial ruin for both of them. The network of allies that Sarah and I assembled over the following months represented a cross-section of people who had been harmed by the Caldwell family's abuse of power. There was Elena Vasquez, whose elderly father had died from unnecessary procedures at one of Frank's nursing homes. There was Michael Torres, a former employee who had been fired and blacklisted for questioning Derek's treatment of female coworkers. There was Judge Patricia Williams, who had been pressured to dismiss cases against the Caldwell family and was tired of watching them escape consequences for their actions. Each ally brought unique skills and resources to our coalition. Elena had connections in the Latino community that provided safe houses and translation services for women escaping abusive relationships. Michael had insider knowledge of Frank's business operations and copies of documents that proved financial crimes dating back decades. Judge Williams had the legal authority to ensure that future cases against the Caldwell family would receive fair hearings rather than predetermined dismissals. Our investigation expanded to include surveillance of Derek and Frank's activities, documenting their methods of intimidation and control for use in future legal proceedings. We discovered that their pattern of abuse extended far beyond romantic relationships to include employees, tenants, business partners, and anyone else who challenged their authority. The scope of their crimes was staggering, involving millions of dollars in fraud and dozens of victims who had been silenced through threats, bribery, or violence. The most crucial breakthrough came when we located Jennifer Morrison, Derek's ex-girlfriend from Minnesota who had originally pressed domestic violence charges before suddenly disappearing. Jennifer had been living under an assumed name in Oregon, working as a waitress and trying to rebuild her life after Frank Caldwell's threats had forced her to abandon her home, job, and family. Sarah's gentle approach and promise of legal protection convinced Jennifer to share her story and provide evidence that proved Derek's long history of escalating violence. Jennifer's testimony revealed that Derek's pattern of abuse followed a predictable timeline that typically ended in life-threatening violence after 18 to 24 months. Based on this timeline, Stephanie was approaching the most dangerous phase of her relationship, when Derek's need for absolute control would likely drive him to attempt murder rather than risk losing his victim to escape or outside intervention. The urgency of Stephanie's situation forced us to accelerate our plans, even though we hadn't gathered all the evidence we wanted for a comprehensive case against both men. Sarah began preparing criminal charges against Derek for his previous assaults while simultaneously building a civil case that would expose Frank's role in covering up his son's crimes. We knew we would only get one chance to strike effectively before they realized the extent of our investigation and took steps to silence us permanently. My personal preparation for the final confrontation involved learning skills I had never imagined needing. I took self-defense classes, obtained a concealed carry permit, and learned how to use recording equipment that could capture evidence without being detected. Most importantly, I practiced controlling my emotional reactions so that I could remain calm and strategic even when confronted with Derek's violence or Frank's threats. The decision to purchase a gun was the most difficult choice I made during the entire ordeal. As someone who had never owned a weapon or believed in solving problems through violence, the idea of carrying a pistol felt like a fundamental betrayal of my values. However, Sarah reminded me that the Caldwell family had already demonstrated their willingness to use physical force against anyone who threatened their control. My moral principles would not protect me from a bullet, and being dead would not help Stephanie escape her abusers. The concealed carry classes taught me more than just weapon safety and marksmanship. I learned about the psychological dynamics of violent confrontations and the importance of projecting confidence even when feeling terrified. The instructor, a retired police officer who specialized in domestic violence cases, explained that predators like Derek typically targeted victims who appeared vulnerable and unlikely to fight back effectively. Simply knowing that I was armed and trained would change my body language in ways that might prevent violence rather than escalate it. As we prepared for the final phase of our campaign against the Caldwell family, Stephanie's situation became increasingly desperate. Mrs. Rodriguez reported that Derek had installed additional locks on their apartment door that could only be opened from the inside, effectively making Stephanie a prisoner in her own home. He had also disconnected their landline phone and taken control of her cell phone, cutting off her access to outside communication except when he was present to monitor her conversations. The most alarming development came when Mrs. Rodriguez overheard Derek making plans for what he called a permanent solution to the problems caused by Stephanie's family interference. The conversation, which took place during one of Frank's visits, included references to accidents that could happen to people who didn't know when to mind their own business. The implicit threat against my life was clear, but more importantly, Derek seemed to be planning something devastating for Stephanie herself. Sarah and I realized that we were running out of time for a careful legal approach. Derek's escalating threats suggested that he was planning to eliminate both Stephanie and me before we could expose his crimes. We would need to force a confrontation on our terms, in a setting where we controlled the circumstances and could ensure that evidence of their criminal behavior would be preserved regardless of the outcome. The plan we developed was risky and depended on precise timing and Derek's predictable need to demonstrate his dominance in front of his father. We would create a situation where Derek felt compelled to reveal his true nature publicly, in front of witnesses who could testify about his behavior and recording equipment that would capture evidence of his violence. If successful, the confrontation would provide enough evidence to arrest both men and free Stephanie from their control. If unsuccessful, at least Stephanie would see Derek's mask slip away and understand that her mother had been trying to save her rather than harm her. The family dinner was Derek's idea, presented to Stephanie as an opportunity for healing and reconciliation after months of estrangement from her mother. He had convinced her that my recent, bizarre behavior, and legal troubles were symptoms of a mental breakdown brought on by grief and loneliness. As her husband, he felt responsible for helping me get the professional help I needed, and the first step would be a controlled meeting where we could discuss my problems in a supportive family environment. Frank Caldwell enthusiastically supported his son's plan, seeing it as an opportunity to demonstrate the family's magnanimity while ensuring that any future accusations I might make would be dismissed as the ravings of someone who was clearly mentally unstable. They invited Mrs. Rodriguez as an additional witness, calculating that her presence would make their performance more credible while providing an audience for my expected emotional breakdown. I accepted the invitation knowing it was a trap, but confident that Sarah's preparation had given me the tools necessary to turn Derek's plan against him. The recording equipment hidden in my purse would capture everything that happened, while the backup team positioned outside would ensure that help arrived quickly if the situation became violent. Most importantly, I had finally accepted that saving Stephanie might require me to sacrifice my own safety and reputation. The dinner began with an elaborate performance of family harmony designed to make me appear unstable by contrast. Derek played the concerned son-in-law who just wanted his wife to have a relationship with her mother, while Frank positioned himself as the wise patriarch trying to heal old wounds through compassion and understanding. Stephanie, still fragile from her head injury and confused by the conflicting narratives she had been given, seemed genuinely hopeful that the evening might restore some peace to her life. For the first hour, I played along with their script, allowing them to treat me with condescending kindness while they explained their concerns about my mental health and social isolation. Derek spoke eloquently about the importance of family forgiveness, while Frank offered to help me find appropriate counseling services and financial assistance. To any outside observer, they appeared to be generous men trying to help a troubled woman who had lost her way after a personal tragedy. The dynamic began to shift when I started asking specific questions about Derek's treatment of Stephanie, framed as innocent concern about their relationship rather than accusations of abuse. I mentioned noticing that Stephanie seemed more withdrawn lately and wondered if the stress of our estrangement was affecting her health. Derek's responses were perfectly calibrated to sound reasonable while revealing his true controlling nature to anyone who understood what to listen for. When I asked Stephanie directly about her happiness and whether she felt supported in pursuing her own goals and interests, Derek immediately interrupted to answer for her. He explained that as her husband, he was in the best position to understand her needs and desires, many of which she was too modest or confused to express herself. The interruption was delivered with a smile, but the underlying message was clear. Stephanie was not allowed to speak for herself about her own experiences. The first crack in Derek's facade appeared when I asked Stephanie about her work at Frank's property management company and whether she was learning skills that might help her return to marketing eventually. Derek's face darkened as he explained that Stephanie had already found her true calling in supporting his career and would not need to pursue outside employment once they started having children. When Stephanie looked surprised and started to speak, Derek placed his hand on her arm in what appeared to be an affectionate gesture but was actually a warning signal she had been trained to recognize. Frank sensed his son's growing agitation and attempted to redirect the conversation toward my need for professional mental health treatment. He spoke at length about the stages of grief and the importance of accepting help when personal problems became too overwhelming to handle alone. His words were delivered with practiced sympathy, but his eyes remained cold and calculating as he watched my reactions for signs of the breakdown they expected. The explosion came when Stephanie quietly mentioned that she sometimes missed her old job and wondered if she might take a part-time position somewhere just to get out of the house occasionally. Derek's reaction was instantaneous and revealing. He grabbed a handful of her hair and yanked her head back hard enough that we all heard her neck crack, his mask of civilized behavior completely falling away in a moment of pure rage. "You don't get to want things that I haven't approved," Derek snarled, his voice carrying a level of venom that made even Frank look momentarily uncomfortable. "Your job is to be grateful for what I provide and stop entertaining stupid ideas about independence." The room fell silent except for Stephanie's quiet whimpering as Derek maintained his grip on her hair, forcing her head back at an angle that made breathing difficult. Mrs. Rodriguez sat frozen in shock, clearly witnessing this level of violence for the first time despite months of hearing it through apartment walls. Even Frank seemed surprised by the sudden escalation, though his reaction was not horror but something closer to pride. "Good boy," Frank said, raising his wineglass in what appeared to be a toast to his son's demonstration of dominance. "That's how you handle a woman who forgets her place." The words hit me like a physical blow, crystallizing everything I had suspected about this family's attitudes toward women and violence. Frank wasn't surprised by Derek's abuse because he had taught his son that controlling women through fear was not only acceptable but admirable. The casual cruelty of his response revealed that this was not an isolated incident but part of a lifelong pattern of normalized violence. I set down my fork, placed my hands flat on the table, and slowly stood up. The motion was deliberate and controlled, carrying none of the emotional volatility they had expected from someone experiencing a mental breakdown. Instead, my silence conveyed something far more dangerous, the calm determination of someone who had finally seen enough and was ready to act. Derek released Stephanie's hair and turned his attention to me, clearly expecting either tears or angry accusations that would confirm their narrative about my instability. What he saw instead was a woman who had been transformed by months of preparation and planning into someone capable of matching his capacity for calculated ruthlessness. For the first time in our relationship, Derek looked uncertain about his ability to control the situation. "Sit down," Derek commanded, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "You're making everyone uncomfortable with your dramatic behavior." I remained standing, my silence stretching until it became unbearable for everyone at the table. Mrs. Rodriguez later told me that my expression in that moment was unlike anything she had ever seen, completely calm but somehow terrifying in its intensity. When I finally spoke, my voice carried the authority of someone who no longer feared the consequences of telling the truth. "I have been recording this entire evening," I said quietly, reaching into my purse to reveal the digital recorder that had captured everything. "I have video evidence of Derek's previous assaults on Stephanie. I have financial records proving Frank's fraud against nursing home patients. I have testimony from Derek's previous victims who are ready to testify about his pattern of escalating violence." The color drained from both men's faces as they realized that their carefully planned trap had become their own destruction. Derek started to stand, clearly intending to destroy the recording equipment, but I was ready for that response. "The backup recordings are already in the hands of federal investigators," I continued. "Destroying this device won't save you. Hurting me won't save you. Your only choice now is whether you want to face justice for what you've already done, or add assault and murder charges to your inevitable prison sentences." The next 30 minutes unfolded with the precision of a military operation that Sarah and I had rehearsed dozens of times. While Derek and Frank sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of their situation, I calmly called Detective Lisa Chen, who had been waiting for my signal in an unmarked car 3 blocks away. Within minutes, our dining room was filled with law enforcement officers who had been briefed on the Caldwell family's history and were prepared for potential violence. Derek's arrest was almost anticlimactic after months of escalating tension. He submitted to handcuffs without resistance, though his eyes promised future retaliation in ways that made me grateful for the police presence. Frank proved more difficult, attempting to use his political connections to delay or prevent his detention. His phone calls to judges and city officials were futile. Sarah had spent weeks ensuring that Derek and Frank's allies understood the federal scope of our investigation and the personal consequences of interfering with justice. The evidence we had gathered over 8 months of careful investigation was overwhelming and irrefutable. Derek's assault on Stephanie had been recorded in high-definition video and audio, showing both the violence and Frank's encouraging response. Financial records proved decades of systematic fraud against elderly nursing home residents. Testimony from Derek's previous victims established a clear pattern of escalating domestic violence that had been covered up through intimidation and bribery. Most damaging for both men was the collection of recorded phone calls in which Frank explicitly instructed his son on methods for controlling and punishing women who challenged their authority. The recordings revealed that Derek's abuse of Stephanie was not spontaneous violence but part of a calculated strategy developed and refined over years of collaboration between father and son. Frank's voice could be heard coaching Derek on techniques for breaking women's spirits without leaving evidence that would hold up in court. The media attention surrounding the arrests was intense and largely unfavorable to the Caldwell family. Our local newspaper ran a series of articles exposing their history of corruption and violence, while television stations throughout the state covered the story as an example of how wealth and political influence could be used to enable domestic abuse. Social media discussions were particularly brutal, with community members sharing their own stories of intimidation and retaliation they had experienced from Frank's business operations. Derek's trial began 6 months later and lasted 3 weeks, during which Stephanie was required to testify about years of physical, emotional, and financial abuse. Taking the stand was terrifying for her, but also profoundly healing as she finally had the opportunity to tell her story to people who believed her and took her experiences seriously. Her testimony was powerful not only because of the specific details she provided, but because of the strength and clarity she demonstrated in refusing to minimize or excuse Derek's behavior. Derek's defense strategy was predictable and ultimately ineffective. His attorneys attempted to portray him as a loving husband whose actions had been misunderstood or exaggerated by a vindictive mother-in-law seeking revenge for imagined slights. They suggested that Stephanie's testimony was unreliable due to her head injury and that I had manipulated her into making false accusations against an innocent man who had only tried to protect his wife from my harassment. The defense's approach backfired spectacularly when Derek insisted on testifying on his own behalf. Under cross-examination, his arrogance and sense of entitlement became obvious to everyone in the courtroom. When asked to explain his behavior during our recorded family dinner, Derek actually defended his decision to grab Stephanie's hair, arguing that wives needed firm guidance to prevent them from making choices that would harm their families. His complete lack of remorse or understanding made him utterly unsympathetic to the jury. Frank's legal troubles proved even more complex, involving multiple federal agencies and charges ranging from elder abuse to tax evasion to conspiracy to obstruct justice. His political connections, which had once seemed so powerful, became liabilities as former allies rushed to distance themselves from his criminal activities. The nursing home fraud alone carried potential sentences of decades in federal prison, while his role in covering up Derek's domestic violence added additional charges that could extend his incarceration for the rest of his life. The civil lawsuits filed by Frank's nursing home victims created a separate avenue for justice that was particularly satisfying to watch unfold. Families whose elderly relatives had been subjected to unnecessary procedures and inflated billing were awarded millions of dollars in damages that stripped Frank of most of his remaining assets. The financial judgments ensured that even if he eventually gained release from prison, he would never again have the resources necessary to threaten or intimidate vulnerable people. Derek's sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for all of his victims to address the court about the impact of his violence on their lives. Jennifer Morrison flew in from Oregon to describe how Frank's threats had forced her to abandon her career, family, and identity to escape Derek's abuse. Elena Vazquez spoke about watching her father deteriorate under unnecessary medical procedures designed to generate fraudulent billing. Mrs. Rodriguez testified about the trauma of listening to months of violence through thin apartment walls while feeling powerless to intervene effectively. When my turn came to address the court, I focused not on my own suffering but on the systematic nature of the Caldwell family's abuse and the importance of ensuring that no other families would endure what we had experienced. I spoke about the courage it had taken for Stephanie to testify against her abuser and the strength she had shown in rebuilding her life after years of conditioning designed to destroy her sense of self-worth. Derek received a sentence of 15 years in federal prison for domestic violence, assault, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Frank was sentenced to 25 years for elder abuse, fraud, tax evasion, and his role in facilitating his son's crimes. Both men were also required to pay substantial restitution to their victims and were prohibited from contacting any of us directly or through intermediaries. The sentences felt like vindication after years of watching these men escape consequences for their actions, but the real victory was seeing Stephanie begin to reclaim her identity and independence. The woman who had been reduced to a frightened shadow of herself during her marriage slowly began to rediscover her intelligence, humor, and strength. Watching her transformation reminded me why the fight had been worth every moment of fear and uncertainty. The healing process for both Stephanie and me began long before Derek and Frank were sentenced, but their imprisonment marked the beginning of a new chapter in our lives where safety and hope could coexist. The first year was the most difficult, as Stephanie struggled with trauma responses that made normal activities feel overwhelming and dangerous. Simple things like grocery shopping or answering the phone could trigger panic attacks as her nervous system slowly learned to distinguish between real threats and memories of past abuse. Trauma therapy became a central part of both our lives, with individual sessions to address our specific experiences and joint sessions to repair the relationship damage caused by Derek's manipulation and control tactics. Dr. Rachel Foster, our therapist, specialized in family recovery from domestic violence and helped us understand how abuse affects not only direct victims but everyone who loves them. The therapy sessions were often painful as we confronted the full extent of what Derek had taken from us, but they were also essential for rebuilding trust and communication. One of the most challenging aspects of recovery was learning to forgive ourselves for the choices we had made during the worst periods of abuse. Stephanie struggled with shame about the times she had defended Derek or pushed me away at his direction. I carried guilt about the months when I had been unable to protect her despite recognizing the danger she was in. Dr. Foster helped us understand that these responses were normal survival mechanisms rather than personal failures, and that healing required compassion for ourselves as well as each other. The financial recovery was almost as complex as the emotional healing. Derek had systematically destroyed Stephanie's credit, emptied her savings, and left her with debt that would take years to resolve. I had lost my home and career to Frank's retaliation, leaving me to rebuild my professional life at an age when most people were planning for retirement. We supported each other through the practical challenges of finding work, rebuilding credit, and creating financial independence that could never again be threatened by abusive partners. Stephanie's decision to return to school for a degree in social work represented a turning point in her recovery. The program gave her a sense of purpose and direction that had been missing since Derek had convinced her to abandon her marketing career. More importantly, studying the dynamics of abuse and trauma helped her understand her own experiences in a broader context and provided her with tools for helping other survivors navigate their own healing journeys. My own path led to advocacy work with domestic violence organizations throughout our state. The skills I had learned during our fight against the Caldwell family proved valuable in helping other women gather evidence, navigate legal systems, and develop safety plans for leaving abusive relationships. There was profound healing in transforming our worst experiences into resources that could prevent other families from suffering similar trauma. The friendship that developed between Stephanie and Jennifer Morrison became one of the most beautiful outcomes of our struggle for justice. The two women who had been Derek's primary victims found strength and understanding in each other that facilitated healing for both. Their bond demonstrated how shared trauma, when processed safely, could become a foundation for meaningful connection rather than ongoing isolation. Mrs. Rodriguez remained a central figure in our lives, representing the importance of community awareness and intervention in domestic violence situations. Her courage in documenting Derek's behavior and eventually testifying against him proved that ordinary people could play crucial roles in protecting vulnerable neighbors. We established a neighborhood watch program focused on recognizing and responding to signs of domestic abuse, ensuring that future victims would not suffer in the isolation that had made Stephanie's situation so dangerous. Sarah Martinez became more than our attorney. She became a lifelong friend whose guidance and support extended far beyond our legal case. Her own experience as a domestic violence survivor gave her unique insight into the challenges we faced, while her professional expertise ensured that our fight for justice was strategic and effective. The friendship that developed between us demonstrated how women supporting women could create networks of strength that abusive men could never break. 5 years after Derek's arrest, Stephanie graduated from her master's program in social work and began working as a counselor specializing in trauma recovery. Her personal experience with abuse, combined with professional training and natural empathy, made her extraordinarily effective at helping other survivors navigate their healing journeys. Watching her transform her pain into purpose was one of the proudest moments of my life as her mother. My own work had evolved into consulting with law enforcement agencies on improving their responses to domestic violence cases. The investigation techniques we had developed to expose the Caldwell family's crimes became templates for other complex cases involving wealthy or politically connected abusers. The knowledge that our suffering had contributed to more effective justice for other families provided meaning that helped balance the scales of our trauma. The most important lesson we learned was that love, when combined with courage and strategy, could overcome even the most sophisticated systems of abuse and control. Derek and Frank had used their intelligence, resources, and social connections to create what seemed like an impenetrable wall of protection around their criminal behavior. What they had not anticipated was the fierce determination of a mother who refused to abandon her child and the power of truth when supported by careful documentation and strategic allies. We also learned that healing from trauma is not a destination but an ongoing process that requires patience, self-compassion, and community support. There are still days when unexpected triggers bring back memories of our darkest periods, but we now have the tools and relationships necessary to process those experiences without being overwhelmed by them. The difference between surviving and thriving lies not in the absence of pain, but in the presence of hope and purpose. The courage to speak truth to power, even when the immediate consequences seemed overwhelming, proved to be the foundation of our eventual freedom. Every time we had been tempted to accept defeat and accommodation rather than continue fighting for justice, we had chosen to trust that persistence and preparation would eventually create opportunities for change. Those choices, made day after day despite fear and uncertainty, accumulated into the strength necessary to defeat men who had seemed invincible. As I reflect on our journey from victimization to empowerment, I am struck by how often the most important battles are fought by ordinary people who simply refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable. Neither Stephanie nor I possessed special powers or resources that made us uniquely qualified to take on the Caldwell family's criminal enterprise. What we had was love for each other, determination to seek truth, and willingness to sacrifice our comfort and safety for the possibility of freedom. The ripple effects of our victory extended far beyond our own family to touch dozens of other lives that had been damaged by Frank and Derek's abuse of power. The nursing home residents who received justice for their mistreatment, the women who found courage to leave their own abusive relationships, the community members who learned to recognize and respond to domestic violence, all became part of a legacy that gave meaning to our suffering and purpose to our survival. Sometimes the most powerful response to violence is not immediate retaliation but patient preparation combined with unwavering commitment to justice. The months we spent gathering evidence, building alliances, and developing strategy felt like inaction compared to the dramatic confrontations we saw in movies and television. In reality, that careful groundwork was what made our eventual victory possible and permanent. The silence that filled our dining room when I stood up that November evening was not empty space but compressed potential energy that had been building for months of preparation and years of love. In that moment of perfect stillness, Derek and Frank finally understood that they had underestimated the determination of a mother who would never stop fighting for her daughter's freedom. Sometimes the most devastating weapon is simply standing up and refusing to be moved by intimidation or violence. Our story reminds me that the most important battles for justice are not fought in courtrooms or on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and love over fear. These choices, repeated consistently over time, create the foundation for transformation that seemed impossible when we first began to fight back against forces that appeared overwhelmingly powerful. What questions did this story raise for you about recognizing warning signs in relationships around you? Have you ever had to find the courage to stand up against seemingly impossible odds? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let me know what lessons from our experience might help others in similar situations. Please hit the like button if this story resonated with you, subscribe for more real-life stories of survival and transformation, and share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they are not alone in their struggles. Your support helps these stories reach people who need to know that healing is possible and justice is worth fighting for, even when the path seems impossible. Thank you for listening to our story, and remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand up and refuse to be silenced. May you always have the courage to protect the people you love and the wisdom to know that your voice matters more than you might imagine.